In 1815, a man stood on the cliffs of Dover and watched a boat arrive from Belgium. He didn't wait for the news to reach London. He already knew Napoleon had lost at Waterloo, and before a single British soldier had returned home, before the Prime Minister had been informed, before the markets had any idea what had happened, this man walked calmly onto the floor of the London Stock Exchange and began to sell. Everyone panicked. If he was selling, Napoleon must have won. The market collapsed. And then, just before the floor hit zero, his agent swept in and bought everything. Every bond, every share, for pennies. By the time the real news arrived that Britain had actually won, Nathan Rothschild had made a fortune so large it altered the financial architecture of an entire civilization. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. That wasn't the beginning. And it was nowhere near the end. To understand the Rothschilds, you have to forget everything you think you know about wealth. Most rich families own things: land, factories, ships. The Rothschilds owned something far more dangerous. They owned the moment between when something happened and when the world found out. That gap, that thin, silent space between event and information, was their empire, and they built it with pigeons. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Germany. Not the city of Frankfurt. The ghetto, a walled-off, locked at night, legally suffocating section of the city where Jews were forbidden from owning land, entering certain streets, or practicing most professions. The house he was born in had a red shield painted above the door, Rothschild in German, and that became the family name. From that locked ghetto, from that single house with a painted shield, Mayer Amschel built something the world had never seen. Not a bank, a network. He placed 5 sons in 5 cities: Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Amschel in Frankfurt, Karl in Naples. 5 brothers, 5 capitals, 1 family, 1 code, 1 loyalty. While other bankers were serving individual kings, the Rothschilds were serving all of them simultaneously, collecting information from every throne in Europe, passing it through encrypted letters carried by their own private couriers faster than any government could move. They didn't just finance power, they became the circulatory system through which power flowed. And then came Waterloo. Nathan Rothschild had his own intelligence network embedded in the battlefield. When Wellington defeated Napoleon on June 18, 1815, a Rothschild courier named Roworth rode to the coast, crossed the channel in rough seas, and reached Nathan a full day before the official British dispatch arrived. What Nathan did next has been debated by historians for 2 centuries. The story, perhaps legend, perhaps cold documented fact, perhaps both, is that he walked to the exchange the next morning, stood at his usual pillar, and began selling British consols, government bonds, the most trusted financial instrument in the empire. Other traders watched him. They trusted his information over their own. The logic was simple and devastating. Rothschild has the best intelligence. If he's selling, we've lost. The panic was immediate. Prices cratered, and then his agents, operating separately, quietly, systematically, bought everything back at the bottom. By the time news of Wellington's victory became public, Nathan had reportedly multiplied his holdings many times over. Some historians dispute the scale. None dispute that it happened. But what is never discussed, what the textbooks skim past like it's irrelevant, is what that moment actually meant. It meant that a private family had just demonstrated publicly and undeniably that they could profit from a war fought by nations they did not live in, using information those nations didn't have, moving faster than governments, faster than armies, faster than grief. And no one stopped them. No one could. Because by 1815, governments already needed them too badly to bite the hand. Nathan had loaned the British government the equivalent of several $100 million modern dollars to fund the Napoleonic Wars. Not gifted, loaned, at interest. Wellington's army marched on Rothschild credit. The uniforms, the guns, the food, the horses, financed through bonds that Nathan arranged, underwrote, and sold. The British Empire went to war with borrowed money, and the man holding the debt was standing at a pillar in the London Stock Exchange, watching the market move in real time. Think about what that means. The government that won the war came out of it deeper in debt to a private banker than when it went in. Victory itself was a financial product. This pattern, war as debt, debt as control, control as dynasty, did not end with Napoleon. It evolved. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild network had financed railways across Europe, the purchase of the Suez Canal, Cecil Rhodes's expansion into Africa, and the stabilization of multiple government currencies. They had become so embedded in the financial structure of Western civilization that when the United States needed emergency gold reserves during the Panic of 1895, President Grover Cleveland quietly turned to J.P. Morgan, who was himself deeply connected to Rothschild capital, to arrange a private bailout of the American Treasury. The wealthiest government in the Western Hemisphere could not solve its own crisis without involving a network that traced back to a ghetto in Frankfurt. Then came 1914, the Great War. The war that killed 17 million people, destroyed 4 empires, redrew every map in the known world, and broke the psychological spine of Western civilization. The question that historians have danced around for a century is devastatingly simple. Who paid for it? Wars of that scale don't run on patriotism. They run on steel, oil, explosives, food, transport, and credit. Oceans of credit. Both sides needed financing. Britain needed it. France needed it. Russia needed it. And here is the part that should make the room go quiet. Germany needed it too. The House of Rothschild had branches, investments, and financial relationships across all of these countries simultaneously. Nathaniel Rothschild, by 1914, was considered the single wealthiest individual on Earth. The London branch had deep ties with the British government, the Paris branch with the French, and the Frankfurt branch, though it had been wound down by then, had left behind a dense web of financial relationships within German banking circles. The Rothschilds did not directly finance both sides of World War I in the way the myths sometimes exaggerate, but the system they had built, the international bond market, the interconnected banking networks, the model of sovereign debt financing, was the architecture through which the war was funded by everyone. They had spent 100 years constructing a financial world in which nation-states could not go to war without going into debt, and could not go into debt without going through the mechanisms they had designed. They didn't need to sign the checks, they had designed the checkbook. What they did do, documented, confirmed, and deeply consequential, was shape what happened after. Arthur James Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary in 1917. On November 2nd of that year, he wrote a letter, 1 page, addressed to Walter Rothschild, the second Baron Rothschild, the de facto leader of the British Jewish community and a direct heir of Nathan's legacy. The letter stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and would use its best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It became known as the Balfour Declaration. It became the founding document of the modern state of Israel. The implications of that letter cannot be overstated. Britain was in the middle of the most catastrophic war in human history. It was hemorrhaging men, money, and international credibility. And in that moment, the Foreign Secretary did not write to a head of state, or a religious leader, or an elected body. He wrote to a Rothschild, because the Rothschilds, through a century of financial entrenchment, political relationship building, and philanthropic investment in the Zionist cause, had become the address to which the British government delivered its most consequential promises. Walter Rothschild handed the letter to the Zionist Federation, and 30 years later, after another world war, the state of Israel was established in the exact territory that letter had pointed to. Whether you view Israel's creation as justice, tragedy, miracle, or catastrophe, depends entirely on your history and your humanity. But what is not debatable, what is simply coldly factual, is that the letter establishing its ideological foundation was addressed to a private family, not a government, not an institution, a family. A family that started in a locked ghetto in Frankfurt with a painted red shield above the door. This is what makes the Rothschild story different from every other wealth story in history. The Medicis were powerful. The Rockefellers were vast. The Vanderbilts were staggering. But none of them wrote the terms on which wars were fought. None of them received foreign policy commitments from empire. None of them built a system so deeply embedded in the structure of civilization that even the nations who resented them could not function without them. The conspiracy theories that surround this family, and they are legion, and they are often grotesque, and they have been used to justify horrors, exist because the truth itself, the documented, archival, academically verified truth, is already extraordinary enough to seem impossible. No invention is required. The pigeons, the Waterloo Trade, the sovereign loans, the Balfour Letter. These are not myths. They are in the ledgers. They are in the archives. They are in the letters themselves. What the myths get wrong is the tone. The Rothschilds were not a shadowy cabal pulling strings in darkness. They were in many ways brilliant, disciplined, often visionary human beings who found a gap in the architecture of civilization. The gap between information and ignorance, between capital and desperation. And they filled it with a relentless, multi-generational focus that no royal family, no empire, no elected government could match. Because no royal family stayed focused for 5 generations. No empire survived without them, and no elected government could think beyond the next election. They played a game no one else was playing, on a board no one else could see, across a timeline no one else was willing to hold. And somewhere in the ledgers of the 1815 London Stock Exchange, a man leans against a pillar watching the numbers fall, knowing something the world does not yet know, waiting with a patience so absolute it looks like indifference.